Today's video is sponsored by Brilliant. What is the biggest pitfall of world building when it comes to story? In some ways, well, it's world building.
Who are you talking to right now? Do you know how much I make a year? No, you clearly don't know who you're talking to, so let me clue you in. I am not in danger, Skylar. I am the danger.
But it really depends on one key thing. Why are you world building? If you're world building just to build a big imaginative world or explore and express your creativity, then have at it. Why are you here? Go build your world. Forget what I have to say about it. But if you're trying to tell a story, then, well, world building is something else entirely. A common problem that I often see with clients of mine and in my own writing sometimes is that when it comes to world building, we often don't know how much is too much and how much is too little, or where to really focus all of our time and energy, and how long we should be focusing it on certain things. Usually this is something you will get a feel for from project to project, depending also on the genre or subgenre you're writing in. The amount can really vary based on these things. In some stories, a lot of world building might not really feel like it if done correctly. But other times, even when there is just the barest amount of world building, it can feel blunt and flat and overbearing. So to help with this, I've come up with a system that can be used during the planning and outlining phase, but also when it comes to the actual writing of your story, for peripheral and indulgent world building. These three categories will help bucket your world building elements using more specifically the point of view characters you have as the canvas, rather than looking at the entire world your story is set within. These will mostly work on a meta level and during the world building research phase, when trying to choose what elements to include in your story. But it'll also be helpful when actually getting down and writing. Okay, but let's back up for a second. What do I mean when I'm talking about world building CPI? And this acronym doesn't have anything to do with the consumer price index. Instead, this is a world building principle that I've come up with that will help you figure out what you should be world building, what world building elements should be included in your story, and how to tie all of this to your characters, making it resonate on a deeper level. And I should say, keep in mind that these percentages, that they should not be taken ultra literally. Among the theoretical conversations, it might feel like some of the magic is getting taken out of writing and world building. And in some cases, it maybe is. In some ways, I think that is true, but we are trying to tell a story and you've got a fever and I'm the only one who's got your prescription.
Guess what? I got a fever and the only prescription is more cowbell.
Your sickness is world builder disease. It's not that your story needs more cowbell. And please don't write a story that features a bunch of cowbells. This is a boomer meme, and I am so sorry. But what I'm trying to say is that this framework will help you get past the endless world building and researching phase that so many writers find themselves in, and will actually get you to the actual writing of the story and using all of those notes that you've crammed into your notes apps or into a spare journal. So let's get into it. If you're getting value out of this video, please consider liking and even subscribing, as it really helps the channel out. Fallout, both the game and recently the TV show, has some of the most immersive world building, despite the fantastical and absurd themes in this crazy wasteland. The root of every story in this franchise and in this universe builds from the same things: the nuclear aftermath, a 50s aesthetic, and vault society and conspiracies. The Broken Earth trilogy constructs a society and civilization around orogeny, the magic system that allows its users to use earth-shaping and manipulating power. Dune has the spice melange, where the economies, religions, ecology, and power, both political and metaphysical, depend on this resource. In BioShock, Atom and the plasmid biotechnology are integral to the social order within Rapture, spawning the moral and mechanical dilemmas the player faces throughout the game's story. And in Neon Genesis Evangelion, the existence and rules of the EVAs and AT fields create the structure for the world politics, personal traumas, and the identity for every major character. The core world-building elements within each of these examples do something very important. They focus primarily on 2 to 3 world-building pillars that directly drive the story's conflicts, the narrative, and the choices that the characters must make. Everything else, no matter how cool or important it is secondary in some ways. The point of view characters dramatically impact what is core, peripheral, and indulgent in terms of world building, but more on that point later. Even though we are talking about world building, there is a hierarchy of storytelling that drives how we implement and include world building. Story, characters, plot, setting, and themes as sort of a bonus. And this is a hierarchy. It does fall in this order. If your world building isn't relating to the story, it needs to have some impact on the characters and or their development. If it doesn't have a noticeable role in a character or their arc, it needs to impact the plot in a specific way. And if it doesn't impact the plot, well, then it isn't really a core part of your world building. And you need to ask, how important is this? And am I spending too much time and energy on it? Now, I did put setting and theme up there to at least acknowledge, but when it comes to the core world building elements, having your world establish the setting is kind of a given. And having it reflect the themes of your story is a nice to have, but isn't essential. At the end of the day, the core world building elements should at least hit one of these things. But if it could hit more than one, all the better. In one of my all-time favorite TV shows, The Leftovers, the core world building element is the hook of the story, the rapture. 2% of the world's population vanishes, leaving behind everyone else, the leftovers. Every element of this fictional reality is integrated into every part of the hierarchy of storytelling I mentioned earlier. Every cult, every historical event, every character and their backstory and the prophecies stem from and explores the fallout of this mass event. The world and the story are intertwined. The characters belong here, and the plot moves in tandem with the exploration of this alternate reality. The Leftovers is pretty truncated in its world building, making it feel deep and rich. Stalker is another example of this. Stalker is somewhat of a niche video game franchise, depending on the types of games you play. But it is based on the 1979 Soviet science fiction film, which is based loosely on the 1972 novel Roadside Panic. Each of them all have a deeply atmospheric world. Even though the world, the artifacts, and the anomalies aren't the most original, Stalker takes place in an area called The Zone, an alternative version of the present-day Chernobyl exclusion zone in modern-day Ukraine. It still has a haunting level of depth to it, despite its unoriginality on the surface. From the plot to the characters, the creatures, the factions, everything is connected to the zone. Every part of the story is related to the world, making the world building feel earned, essential, and unique. And I will point out that the big thing in common with all of these core elements is that they are somewhat contrasted with things that we have in our own world, which makes it easy to suspend our disbelief and be immersed in what is on the page. Stalker and The Leftovers both take place within our world, making this integration easier. But what about an example of a fantastical world? What do we do then? Well, simply put, the same principles apply. Although Usually the magic system, if there is one, will probably play a larger role. But it's important to find other complementary things that might be common with our own real world, but add a level of contrast in this fictional world. And even though I kind of mentioned this is applied to fantasy, don't just assume it only applies to fantasy worldbuilding. This principle applies to both science fiction and even horror as well. For instance, in a sort of fun venture fantasy story like Salen Ascends, all of the world building is focused on the Tower of Babel, a fictional Tower of Babel that's based on the idea surrounding the fabled Tower of Babel. Or we can look at a Song of Ice and Fire, or a Game of Thrones, the TV show, where the core world building elements that we see for every point of view character is the feudal political systems being directly tied to family lineage or secession and oath-bound hierarchies. Everything world building and lore wise within Song of Ice and Fire is impacted by or has an impact on these things. But this world feels so familiar because it's based so closely on feudal Europe and Near Eastern history. It's very true to the real world, and when it differs, delving into the fantastical elements, they stand out, but stand out on a sturdy foundation of something familiar. When looking at your story or your massive Bible of world building items, the key thing to identify when trying to understand what to include, especially for the core world building elements, is this: what part of my world building will have the most impact on the story? What part of my world building will be the most relevant to my point of view character? How does my world building impact the plot? If you can answer these questions, however brief or not, you're off to a good start and can kind of begin moving on from these core world building elements and start looking at the finer details, the peripheral world building elements next. And so far, you might have noticed that the core peripheral and indulgent framework is more about an exercise of world building discipline, where you have to decide what really matters, what helps the scene, and what's purely exposition. The hard part isn't necessarily creating your world. The hard part is training the habit of choosing the right stuff for your story. That's where Brilliant actually fits into a writer's toolbox, which is why I am excited to have them sponsor today's video. Brilliant's lessons are interactive problems that actually contribute to you learning the subject at hand, while also building healthy mental habits. And maybe getting better at this will even help you in deciding what belongs in your story's core, peripheral, or indulgent world building categories. Do a 5 or 10-minute deduction or logic lesson, and you'll start spotting the "does this drive the story" moments sooner. Or maybe you'll take a lesson in engineering and all of a sudden you'll realize you need to have a character who knows something about engineering. Brilliant helps you build that muscle, one short hands-on problem at a time. And it's a great way to make learning a daily habit. It also might teach you something about the world you're building as well. One of the aspects I love about Brilliant is its proven method for a more effective way to learn. When you take Brilliant's lessons, you don't just watch explanation videos. You work through problems that help make concepts click. The active approach, hands-on puzzles, immediate feedback, and progressively harder challenges. The platform scaffolds learning from foundational concepts to harder problems, so you can set short daily goals, track real improvement, and come back to your writing with clearer, sharper judgment. The learning goals features gives immediate feedback and is easy to incorporate into your daily habits. Learn for free on Brilliant. Go to brilliant.org/wrestling with words, or you can scan the QR code on screen. Also, you can click on the link down in the description below. Brilliant also is giving you a 20% off the annual premium subscription, which gives you unlimited daily access to everything on Brilliant. Get started today. Thank you again to Brilliant for sponsoring today's video. A lot of what makes this system work happens on the front end, starting with the core elements and then trickling down to the peripheral and eventually the indulgent. We are adding a lot of economic memes in here, aren't we? Peripheral world building elements should be like the branches growing out from the main trunk of your core elements. If you want to think of your world building like a tree.
Wow.
Peripheral world building is the stuff that doesn't necessarily drive the main conflict, but supports it by creating plausibility, immersion, character specific connection points, genre resonance, and or foreshadowing for later, more important elements. The big thing here is that we want to use the peripheral elements to build the illusion of depth, or to use another symbolic example, help cast a bigger shadow. But isn't that cheating? Isn't this just a shallow trick? Yes and no. The thing is that you just don't have enough time and your audience doesn't have enough interest yet. The exceptions and the unicorns will always be the big name franchises, but at the end of the day, we need to focus specifically in terms of what appears on the page, on how to enhance the story and deepen the sympathetic bond with the characters. Peripheral elements are what we use to do that. In Dune, the spice melange is the core world building element for the story. This affects everything from the political systems to the great houses and spacing guilds and even the Fremen society. The peripheral world building elements in Dune might be the deeper understanding of the ecology on Arrakis, or the logistics of trade and space harvesting, the Bene Gesserit household minutiae, how warfare is actually conducted, and even the religious operations and minor cults, the seiches, shrines, and pilgrim marks. It can also be those things that the spice influences, but more on a niche level. Are all of these things important? Yes, some more than others, obviously. But on their own and individually, if any of them became the main focus, do they really give us a deeper and more intricate perspective or understanding without some kind of big narrative payoff? Not really. They all kind of feed back into those main world building elements within Dune, while also building out the story, characters, and the narrative's plot. They respond directly to the hierarchy of storytelling. Even though these are peripheral world-building elements, they still relate to the story, the characters, and the plot. And quite frankly, they feel like they carry more weight than they do. But that's part of that illusion. However, the important part here is that we show a significant level of restraint on the actual page, depending on how important these things are to a character or the narrative. We so often hear about the iceberg theory, and I've spoken about this in previous videos. But in reality, I've come to kind of fall in the camp that it's not really an iceberg, but it's more of a hollow iceberg. These peripheral elements are necessary for the story, characters, and plot, but where they differ from the core elements is that they are here to help build that illusion of depth. Take, for instance, again, in Salient Ascents, the peripheral elements are things like the different ringdoms, the technological levels of the world. This is somewhat slowly revealed towards the end of the story, having it become some kind of steampunk setting. And even the magic that is present. By the end of the first book, none of these things are really explained or even explored with all that much depth. But it feels like each of them has a place in the world, leaving some mysteries and parts of the world to still be discovered. And a similar aspect also relates to the Stalker film and games. Tarkovsky's Stalker uses peripheral world-building elements to deepen the atmosphere and ambiguity associated with its world. Small props, domestic fragments, the human fallout. The Stalker games treat many of the same items as playable systems, markets, factions, and mutants. In both mediums, those things offer a kind of texture to the story. They don't explain the zone's core mystery, but they make it believable and lived in. The illusion of depth doesn't mean that you haven't thought about these things or the details associated with your world building. It's more about the restraint and ambiguity that you leave on the page, avoiding long info dumps and exposition where you might be over explaining these things. This bucket, the peripheral items, are things that will build immersion, cohesion, and at times fulfill genre expectations. They are here to enrich the experience of the story and flesh out the character's relationship within this place. But don't forget that this part really helps fortify the depth or the illusion of depth in your world. And finally, we come to the main symptom of world builder's disease, the indulgent world building elements. But here, the indulgent elements are this. They are the important minor details. It is the surgical table, not the trash, but the recycling. This is where all of that stuff that you might have worked on or researched, but can't find a relevant path into your story, whether they are included because they are interesting enough to justify their inclusion or because they build the illusion of depth. These world building elements should be the exception. However, in some cases, even rarer than the aforementioned expectations, the indulgent aspects can be used to set up other things farther down the line for future installations, characters, and even plot beats. We can look at the songs and motifs in a Song of Ice and Fire or a Game of Thrones. Is it deeply important that we recognize the Reigns of Castamere and know its origins and its meaning? No, not really. But it is pretty damn cool when it's played during the Red Wedding and you realize what's going on before it's happening. And sometimes George R. R. Martin goes into excruciating detail about food and banquets, which adds flavor but doesn't really drive the plot in any way. And speaking of food, in The Leftovers, some of the peripheral world building elements can include the historical context of memorials, the rituals, and the background of the guilty remnant or other cults, and even the fringe movements that have come and gone. However, the indulgent aspects would be minor characters' backstories and how they were impacted by the rapture or their full micro histories. When we see the senator in the first episode going to Holy Wayne, we don't get a detailed breakdown, or even any breakdown really, of the current political system in the world. The best way to think of indulgent world building elements that still function or impact your story is to think of them like the flavor text in video games, or the text associated with an item or ability or a point of interest. But I wouldn't say any flavor text, but flavor text that really matters, like in Elden Ring. The same goes for some of the other Souls games. They use terse, often ambiguous item descriptions as a primary vehicle for lore and world building. Each item packs a small factual beat or a provocative hint that, when stitched together with other items and NPC dialogue and the environment, lets players reconstruct history and lore, or not in some cases. Those descriptions mix mechanical clarity, what the item actually does, with fragmented cultural details, unreliable perspectives, and contradictory hints. All of this creates depth, mystery, and a player-driven interpretation. In some ways, Elden Ring's world building is almost too ambiguous to try and fit them into any of these categories. However, me personally, and I think for the player base, the world building and even the storytelling is just chef's kiss. The devs and writers do a ton of visual storytelling throughout the world. That is kind of a given. But the descriptions and flavor text are really what give us a great deal of added perspective. In a way, that is really telling the story. If you're interested in taking the time to piece the hints together, the payoff is well worth it. But in a way, if you skip all of the item descriptions and most of the side characters' dialogue, you can still play the game and understand the gist of the story and the world. but you would miss out on so much compounding detail. This is how indulgent world building should operate. But in the context of what you are working on, there is a reality every writer faces, an economy of words. The indulgent section here only works if you have a good understanding of the core of your world building and the branching peripheral aspects. The indulgent parts then become the twigs and leaves and roots, giving an added level of life to your world. When we talk about something being as wide as the ocean but as deep as a puddle, it's probably because a creator or a writer has inverted this concept. Good world building is, in some ways, all about manipulating your audience. Go into great detail about something small and essential to the story and characters. Know that thing really, really well and win over your audience with that. Build their trust then for the peripheral, indulgent, and even the unmentioned world elements. Your audience will trust you have the same level of deep detail, but that you're just withholding it. But the truth is, you might be, or you know just enough to cast a big shadow, or that you've constructed a hollow iceberg just below the surface. With all that understood, how exactly do we implement this? First, don't overbuild your core. You only need a few pillars. One per main point of view character should be enough to start with. Second, we need to lean into the peripheral elements to give the illusion of depth and make these peripheral elements important to the characters. Don't mistake these things for the main bulk of your world building. And finally, the indulgent details will be a select few elements that you will go into great detail to build immersion, establish trust with your audience, and create the illusion of depth and breadth. It is important too to keep in mind that different genres and mediums and even subgenres might shift the percentages and the focus of what exactly you should be world building. For hard science fiction, you might be focusing more on systems, the core revolving around science, math, or technology. Fantasy core might be the magic systems and social hierarchies or even religion, and horror core might be the rules of the monsters or the legends and folklore. In this breadth, there are two big ways that you can use this method to help with your world building. Either you can apply it generally to your story. Here you start with one core, one peripheral, and one indulgent element and slowly build out from there. It's also important to say that this breaks down if you just continue to balloon out your world and end up including everything all over again.
Not quite my tempo.
This method is here to help you really consider what is important and what is necessary. Or the other way, and this is more of the method that I kind of advocate for, but will depend on how many point of view characters you have. I think this one works best because you will assign one core, peripheral, and indulgent element for every main point of view character. And you can have overlapping core, peripheral, or indulgent things. And this can change the perspective on those world building elements. I like this method the most because it really makes you consider the world from the viewpoint of every point of view character's eyes. Hyperion is a great example of this, where all of the characters use the same core world building elements as sort of a gravitational core. Each of them share a common core element, but differ on their peripheral and indulgent topics. But let's say that you're writing a space opera of your own, and it is about an occupying hegemony slowly receding from a colonial outpost. The oiler on the orbiting military space cruiser will have a different perspective and see the world differently than the ace pilot being groomed for leadership, who will both have different perspectives from the proxy governor on the surface. If in this example, the core world building elements that this story will explore has to do with maybe the complicated nature of an occupation, or even more generally, governance, how modern warfare is conducted in this setting, and the breakdown between these two different cultures. We will have these three point of view characters that can can really explore these ideas and these elements. Each of these characters can have a unique angle on the core element, as well as adding their own peripheral and indulgent aspect that give this story's world real depth while enhancing the narrative. And that is really what I am trying to offer here with this system. A way to make your world building matter, to make it fit into a story, into your story. Because I love world building and I love talking about world building and exploring it. And I also love that other writers and creators love world building too. There is nothing like a setting or a story that just captures you, making you feel like this fictional place is real or that it could be real. Building something that is deep and immersive is every writer's dream. It's every reader's or viewer's or player's dream too, even if they're being lied to. Thanks for watching this video. Let me know in the comments down below if this concept helps you or maybe makes you think of world building differently. Also, let me know if there is another method that you like to use when it comes to trying to determine what world building is important to your story or your characters or your plot and how you kind of go about implementing it. Also, special thank you to the subscribers and to the channel members. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.